My name is Quentin. I'm 42 years old and I live on a farm in the state of Indiana. I want to share something that happened to me, something I still can't explain. And honestly, I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but what I lived through was real. This story took place about 15 years ago, but to this day, every time I pass by the field where it all happened, a chill runs down my spine. It all started on a hot summer night. I was at the farmhouse, doing my usual chores. My wife Eliza was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and as usual I was more focused on my tasks than on anything else. I've always been skeptical about supernatural things, but that night, everything changed. The field at the back of our property has a scarecrow. It's been there for years, fixed in the same spot with wires and stakes, never moved, until that night. I was in the barn, fixing the tractor, when I felt a strange presence in the air. It wasn't something I could identify, but something was wrong. That's when I saw the shadow in the field. I knew the scarecrow was there, always in the same spot, in front of the cornfield. But that night, it looked different. Sometimes it seemed to move, but the wind was calm, as it always is at that hour. I thought it was just my imagination, so I ignored it, but something bothered me so much that I decided to take a closer look. When I got closer to the fence that borders the field, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The scarecrow wasn't where I had always seen it. It was several meters to the left, still fixed on the same stake, but its body, the face made of cloth, its arms made of straw, were now facing me. I couldn't understand how that was possible. I tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion or something I hadn't noticed before. But when I walked around the fence and looked again, the scarecrow was even farther away, more towards the center of the field. And that wasn't possible. What I did next was a mistake, and I regret it to this day. I decided I would take the scarecrow out of the field and check it. I thought maybe someone was playing a prank, or that I was just getting paranoid. But when I entered the field, the sky began to darken, and a feeling of oppression filled the air. The silence that night was so deep, it felt like even the crickets had stopped singing. Every step I took seemed to echo in the emptiness. The feeling that something was watching every movement of mine was overwhelming. I could feel a weight on my chest, as if an invisible hand was pushing me towards the field. With every step I took, the scarecrow seemed farther away, but at the same time, closer, as if it were moving with me. I got closer to the stake where the scarecrow was fixed, but before I could touch it, the wind suddenly picked up. A cold wind, as if the very air had life, surrounded me. It felt like the field was trying to push me away. When I finally put my hand on the stake, I felt an immense pressure, as if something invisible was preventing me from moving it. Then I heard a muffled sound, a crack, and the scarecrow turned completely towards me. I'm not exaggerating. It turned its cloth head, and its straw arms moved, as if it were watching me. I panicked. What had I done? I ran from there, my heart racing, almost unable to breathe. When I got back to the house, I was distraught, and Eliza was concerned. I tried to explain what had happened, but believe me, there were no words to describe what I had just experienced. I knew no one would believe me. She tried to reassure me, but I couldn't sleep that night. I knew I couldn't let it go. Something very strange was happening, and I didn't know what it was. The next day I went back to the field, almost without courage. The scarecrow was back in its usual spot, in the same position it had always been. I even touched the stake to make sure it was properly fixed. But when I looked at it closely, the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching, made my stomach churn. I tried not to give it too much importance, but something in my mind kept reminding me of that moment. Every time I passed near the field, the scarecrow seemed to be staring at me with its cloth eyes as if it were waiting for me. I didn't tell anyone about what happened the night before. How could I? No one would believe me, and to be honest, I didn't fully believe it myself. But the following weeks were even stranger. During the night, every time I looked out the kitchen window, it seemed like the scarecrow had moved. I didn't want to tell Eliza because I knew she would think I was going crazy. But the feeling was undeniable. On the night of a Friday, I decided to take more drastic action. I would take a camera and take pictures to show her what was happening. When I got close to the field, an even stronger feeling hit me. The scarecrow was there, but it wasn't in the center. It was even farther away, more to the right, near the end of the cornfield, where the bushes were taller. It was impossible that I hadn't seen this before. I was sure it was in another position, completely different from the previous morning. That night, the wind was calm, but I felt a pressure in the air. Something was watching me, as if it were waiting for me to come closer. I was there, with the camera in hand, ready to take a picture, when suddenly a loud scream cut through the silence of the night. It wasn't a human scream. It was more like the sound of something dragging. I looked around, but I didn't see anything except the empty field. Suddenly, the scarecrow began to move. It wasn't a sharp movement, but it seemed like it was walking slowly toward me. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't move. The scarecrow kept coming and panic took over me. I finally ran into the house, locking all the doors behind me. The next day, the scarecrow was back in its usual spot. I looked out the window, and something in my mind told me I wasn't safe there anymore. I went to the local library, hoping to find some explanation. I asked some older people about what could be causing such a phenomenon, but no one knew anything. I even searched on the internet, but the information was vague and disconnected, nothing that explained what was happening on my farm. Time passed, and the scarecrow seemed to be behaving normally, but the discomfort of knowing something strange had happened that night never went away. Every time I look at it, a feeling of cold sweeps through my body, and the same cloth eyes seem to stare at me, as if it's waiting for the right moment to move again. Something in that field, something in that scarecrow, followed me and is still there. To this day I can't understand what happened, but one thing is certain. I never looked at that field the same way again. Sometimes the wind blows differently, and I feel a presence, as if the scarecrow is there, watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to move again. My name is Thomas, I'm 38 years old, and I live in a small town called Oakwood in Ohio. First of all, I know it sounds like a movie story, but what I lived through doesn't have an explanation. It happened about 6 years ago, but it still sends chills down my spine just thinking about what I heard that night. It's not something I've told many people, and now I'm writing it here because I just can't forget. Maybe someone can help me understand what happened. It was a warm September evening, typical of a small town. I had just finished work and decided to take a detour through a dirt road that cut through the cornfield near my house. The place had always been too quiet, almost frozen in time, with that countryside air that seemed both radiant and silent. There was nothing strange about taking this detour because I enjoyed that isolated part of the town to clear my head. But that night, something was different, something I hadn't noticed before. The silence was heavier, as if the whole world had stopped to watch me. I was driving slowly, observing the fields, when I suddenly heard the sound of laughter. It was the laughter of children, but not just one or two. There were many. The sound seemed to come from the middle of the cornfield, but I didn't see anyone. It made no sense. The road was empty, and the last thing I expected was to hear something so bizarre in such a deserted place. I stopped the car, and the laughter grew louder, but still, I didn't see anyone. The field was full. The thickness of the crops made a dense curtain of leaves that blocked my view of anything except green, and more green. You know, I'm the more skeptical type, always looking for a logical explanation for things. So at the time, I tried to convince myself that it could be some kids playing at a nearby farm. But even so, the sound didn't seem normal. It was too strange. The laughter was loud, like it was coming from several children, but it also had something unsettling about it. It didn't sound like playful laughter, it was more like malicious giggling, echoing from all directions. And the more I listened, the more I felt that something was wrong, as if that sound was deceiving me, trying to lure me in. I decided to get out of the car, still trying to find some explanation. I looked around and saw the empty road, just the crops in front of me with nothing else around. I was alone. But the laughter didn't stop. It seemed to surround me, as if several children were all around me, but invisible. The strangest part was that the laughter, instead of sounding normal, started to sound well, more distorted, like it was being manipulated, altered, at a frequency that made me uncomfortable, even afraid. It was then that my instinct for self-preservation began to fail. I didn't know what was going on. I stood still, unsure of what to do. But then, what happened next made me want to run away. The laughter suddenly started to transform. It went from giggling to screaming. There were screams of terror, screams from children asking for help, but at the same time, it felt like they were calling me, as if they knew exactly where I was. I froze. Panic hit me immediately. I was overwhelmed with a sense that something was testing me in some way, or worse, maybe something was trying to pull me into its web, dragging me toward its center. I couldn't move anymore. But then, as if fear had given me a surge of energy, I started walking toward the sound, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could find the origin of that strange feeling. As I got closer to the field, the feeling grew even heavier, as if something was sucking the energy around me. I could no longer hear anything except my own heavy footsteps on the ground. It was as if the atmosphere had completely changed. The air was warmer, thicker, breathing became difficult. It was at that moment that I saw it. It wasn't quite a figure, but a silhouette, a shadow in the middle of the crops. I didn't know if I was seeing things clearly, but it looked like a child, only not in a normal way. It was something too strange. It didn't move. It didn't show any sign of life. It looked like just a shape, a presence. I couldn't look away. Even though the distance between us grew, I felt as if something invisible was pulling me toward that shadow. I stood there for a few seconds. The sound stopped abruptly, as if the universe had decided it was time to make everything stop. What remained was absolute silence, as if the laws of nature had been interrupted. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was getting closer to me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Finally, the impulse to flee surged with force. I turned and ran back to the car. I didn't give myself the luxury of looking back. I just got in and started the engine, speeding down the dirt road as if my life depended on it. My breath was out of control, my body was trembling, and I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. No matter how much I wanted to forget, the feeling that something was still watching me didn't leave. After I got home, I went straight to the computer. I tried to search for explanations, anything that would make sense. I went on paranormal websites, even looked for reports from people who had experienced something similar. I found nothing. Nothing that really compared to the experience I had. The only thing I found was a vague story about a local legend involving children who had disappeared in the area, but it was just a poorly told story and didn't make any sense. And that, somehow, only increased my discomfort. In the following days, I tried to ignore it, tried to live a normal life, but it didn't work. Every time I passed by the dirt road, I felt the cold in my spine. The field looked the same, but something inside me told me that it wasn't the same anymore. Something was there, and I knew it, even without seeing or hearing anything more. The air seemed heavier, the field seemed vaster, and the silence deeper. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I felt a presence, something that hadn't gone away. And every year that passes, every time I approached that road, I felt the same chill. Sometimes I even dreamed about it, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, feeling that fear that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. Whatever happened, I never managed to explain it. I could never understand why those laughs were there, or who that figure was. But the worst part was that even after all this time, I couldn't stop feeling that. Somehow, it was still watching me. To this day, the road is still there, and I still pass by it sometimes, but never alone. I can't. Now I just keep wondering, has anyone else ever heard what I heard or seen what I saw, or was it just something in my head? I don't know, but it doesn't matter, because somehow I know that what happened that night was real, and that something is still waiting there in the cornfield. My name is Meredith. I'm 35 years old, and I live in a small town in rural Kansas. I've always been very connected to my family's farm. I grew up there, visiting my grandparents during the summer holidays. The property has a long history, dating back to the early 1900s when my great-grandfather built the wooden house and the barn. Although the farm was always a place that brought me peace and good childhood memories, there was one summer that changed everything. I never could have imagined something so strange would happen, something that still haunts me to this day. I will try to explain, but I can assure you that after that day, I never looked at the farm the same way. It was the summer of 2018. I was in the middle of a renovation project on the farm after the house started showing signs of wear. My mother had taken over the property after my father passed away, and now I was helping with some of the tasks she didn't have time for. It was one of those tasks that led to inexplicable events. On the first day of work, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I sat on the same garden bench I used to play on, except now, instead of running around the house, I was repairing the old fence and the barn roof, which was falling apart. It was hard work, but familiar. I even enjoyed being back in that place, with the smell of fresh grass and the sound of the wind in the trees. However, something soon caught my attention. While walking through the land to take some photos and document the progress of the renovations, I noticed that one area of the farm seemed different. I knew there hadn't been anything there before, but when I looked through the camera, I saw something that I didn't recognize. It was like an old shed, nearly falling apart, that I had never seen before. The shed appeared suddenly, in the background of one of the photos, in an area of the field that was clear and unobstructed. I was stunned. I looked around, and of course there was nothing there, just field after field. But the photo was there, with the wooden structure clearly visible, sharp and distinct. I even rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but the image was still there. The next day, I went to the spot indicated by the photo, looking for any trace of a shed or anything resembling it. The area was quiet, as it had always been, but there was no sign of any structure at all. There wasn't even a foundation or the remnants of something that had once been there. I felt frustrated, but at the same time, a strange feeling started to grow inside me. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. I showed the photo to my mother, and her reaction was even more unsettling. That looks like the tool shed that used to be over there, she said, with a faraway look. It was torn down a long time ago. It's not possible, Meredith. How did you take this picture? She seemed confused, even scared. I tried to explain that I had no idea how this could have happened, but even my mother didn't know what to make of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tricked by my own eyes, but something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. In the following days, things became even stranger. I began to see other details on the farm that I shouldn't have seen. While walking through the field, almost unconsciously, I stumbled upon a circle of stones in the ground, something that seemed like a water well, but that I didn't remember ever seeing before. This made me think of the old photos, so I went up to the attic to search for the family albums. There they were, the photos, yellowed with age. I looked at each one carefully, and in one of them I saw the well. It was exactly the same spot where I had found the stones. The image was in black and white, but the scene was clear, with the well in the background, exactly where the stone circle now stood. I was frozen. How could this be happening? I was feeling more and more like I was losing my sanity, but at the same time, I knew that it wasn't just my imagination. That night, after finishing my work, I sat on the porch of the house, looking out at the field in the distance. It was a feeling of restlessness, as if something was watching me. I couldn't sleep properly in the following nights, and the strange sensations intensified. That night, something far more terrifying happened. I was alone. My mother was out of town, and I was reviewing some of the photos I had taken. That was when something truly sinister occurred. A specific photo caught my attention. I had taken that photo of the field to the north, near what I now called the well, but when I looked at the image, I saw something that made me break into a cold sweat. In the background of the photo, near the stones, there was a figure. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person, a dark figure, standing stiffly, staring directly at the camera. I couldn't understand. I was alone there. No one was nearby. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it could be a lighting mistake or some kind of reflection, but I knew what I had seen. I knew there hadn't been anyone on the farm but me. I immediately tried to delete the photo, but something stopped me. It was as if the photo had a life of its own, as if I was drawn to it. I couldn't look away. The figure seemed to be watching me, as if it were waiting. Then I felt not just the presence of that person in the photo, but something far more sinister, as if that figure had been following me, waiting for the right moment to appear. In the middle of the night, the noise came. I woke up to a faint sound of knocks on my bedroom window. At first I thought it was the wind, but when I looked through the curtains, I saw something that froze me inside. In the field to the north, where the well had been, there was a faint light, a light that I knew shouldn't be there. And the strangest thing of all, I could clearly see the glass greenhouse, lit up and functioning. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The greenhouse had been demolished decades ago, but there it was, intact, glowing from the inside. Fear overtook me, and as I blinked my eyes, everything disappeared. When I looked again, the field was empty, and the light was gone. I didn't know what to do. I spent the rest of the night locked in my room, with the curtains drawn, listening to the sound of the wind and trying to understand what was happening. The next day, I went to the area where the greenhouse should have been, but there was nothing. The land was quiet, with no signs that anything had ever been there. Still, the image of the greenhouse glowing in the night was fresh in my mind, as if it had been a dream. But it wasn't a dream. I know what I saw. After that, things seemed to stop just as suddenly as they had started. The sheds disappeared, the well and the greenhouse vanished, and somehow the photo started disappearing too. I tried to go back to the spot where I had seen the figure in the photo, but there was nothing left. Everything was as it had been before. When I showed my mother the photos again, she looked at me as if I had made everything up, but I knew I hadn't. Something happened on that farm, something inexplicable. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The images from the old photographs seemed to come to life, bringing back things to the farm that shouldn't exist anymore. But the strangest thing of all is that after that summer, everything just stopped. As if the farm had decided to put everything back in its place and hide its secrets once again. My name is Evelyn. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a small town called Alford in the state of Maine. The town is small, with narrow streets and old houses that seem to have come straight out of an old movie. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and things tend to go by without many surprises. Or at least, that's how it was until something strange started happening. This happened about 5 years ago, and to this day, I still can't quite understand what went on. I moved into an old house on the outskirts of the town, a bit isolated. It was an old house with a large porch and a huge bell hanging outside. At first, I didn't think much of it. It seemed just like a detail of the old architecture. But soon I noticed something strange. On the calmest nights, with no wind, no rain, the bell would start ringing. And it wasn't a soft ring, like the sound of a church bell or some old house bell. It was a loud, clear sound, like someone was pulling it hard. I didn't know what to think. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just something with the old bell mechanism. Maybe it was out of whack or something like that. But it kept happening every night. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. After all, I lived alone, and the silence of the night could play tricks on me. But then I started noticing details I couldn't ignore anymore. The bell seemed to ring louder on nights when the wind was still. It was almost as if it was intentionally ringing, waiting for me to hear it. On that specific night, which became ingrained in my mind, I was in bed, reading a book late into the night. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:58 a.m. I already knew what was coming next. The bell rang exactly at 3. With every toll, a chill ran down my spine. I knew I wasn't imagining it, but something inside me still refused to believe the bell could be ringing on its own. I got up and went to the window in the living room, where the porch was clearly visible. The sky was clear, no clouds. There was no wind, nothing. But the bell kept ringing, as if someone was pulling it forcefully. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence, and it seemed to echo through the house. I didn't know what to do. The only thing that crossed my mind was the idea that someone might be out there, messing with me. Maybe some neighbor who knew my routine and was trying to scare me. But when I looked around the house, I saw no one, no movement. Silence was all I could hear. This went on for several nights. Every night at the same hour, the bell would start ringing. It was impossible to ignore. I was starting to lose my patience. So, on one of the nights, I decided to do something I should have done earlier. I went out to the bell and examined it closely. The porch was dark and cold, and the bell swayed gently without me touching it. I reached out and touched it, but the sound didn't stop. I felt like I was being watched, as if something was observing me from a distance, waiting for me to come closer. It was then that I noticed something even stranger. The bell wasn't just swaying, it was ringing, as if something was moving it from within, like an invisible force was manipulating it. I knew I had to do something about it, so I went to the garage and grabbed a ladder to try and take the bell down. But when I got to it, the sound stopped instantly. The silence was absolute, and I was completely tense. I looked around, but there was no more sign of anything strange. I stood there, staring at the bell, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I noticed something that really scared me. The bell was marked, as if it had been touched many times by invisible hands. The marks looked older than the house itself, like the bell had been there longer than anyone could imagine. The next night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I couldn't just ignore what was happening anymore. When the clock hit 2:58 a.m., I was already wide awake, waiting for the moment when the bell would start ringing. And as expected, it rang. But something was different. The sound wasn't the same. It was louder, closer, almost like it was inside my house. I quickly got up, not knowing what to do. The bell kept ringing, as if something was pushing it. I ran to the porch, not knowing what I was expecting to find. The bell was swaying with force, but no one was there. The sound was louder, denser, and I could feel my heart racing. I looked at the shadows of the house, hoping to find some logical explanation for it all. But nothing. The sound of the bell kept going, as if it was out of control, with no rhyme or reason. I was terrified, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rationalize what was happening. Then came the last night. There were no more bell rings. Nothing. Silence returned, but it was a silence I had never experienced before. I spent hours staring out the window, waiting for the sound to return, but it never did. I never knew what really happened in that house, or if it's still happening. The bell is still there today on the porch, swaying with the wind sometimes. But I never heard that sound again at night. What still scares me to this day isn't the bell, but the fact that after everything I lived through, I've never been able to understand what happened. I researched the house, the bell, old stories. I couldn't find anything that explained what I experienced. And yet, the feeling that something is still there, waiting, has never left me. To this day, when the night falls and silence takes over the house, I find myself looking at the porch, waiting for the bell to ring again. But at the same time, I hope it never does.